Imagine the sensation of standing in a muddy field in northern France, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and nervous sweat. It's October 1415. You're encased in 45 pounds of hardened steel. To the modern observer, you might look like a statue, a rigid, gleaming monument to a bygone era of feudal vanity. But inside the helm, the reality is visceral. Your breathing is loud in your own ears, amplified by the steel enclosure of the bassinet. The visor is a narrow slit, slicing the world into a panoramic strip of gray sky and trampling feet. You're not a statue. You're a highly maneuverable medieval tank, and you're about to walk into a storm of 50,000 arrows. The popular imagination has done a terrible disservice to the medieval man-at-arms. We've been fed a steady diet of Victorian romanticism and slapstick cinema, where knights are hoisted onto horses by cranes. They turtle on their backs, flailing helplessly if they fall, and where armor is a clumsy burden that doomed the aristocracy to extinction at the hands of the nimble yeoman. This narrative is a myth. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of one of the most sophisticated military technologies in human history. In reality, men mortgaged their estates to buy this steel skin, and it reshaped the very way wars were fought. And for 3 centuries, it was the difference between life and death. To understand the effectiveness of armor, we must first accept that armor isn't a singular material. A breastplate is not simply a breastplate. In the 15th century, the difference between a suit of armor made in rural England and one forged in the blast furnaces of Lombardy or Germany was significant. It was the difference between soft iron and hardened tool steel. The effectiveness of the protection was decided at the molecular level long before the hammer ever touched the metal. For much of the Middle Ages, iron was produced in bloomery furnaces. These primitive hearths couldn't reach the melting point of iron, which sits at over 1500 degrees Celsius. Instead, they produced a spongy mass of iron and slag that had to be laboriously hammered to squeeze out impurities. The resulting material, wrought iron, was soft, ductile, and riddled with imperfections. While better than nothing, it was dangerously inadequate against the driving force of a longbow or a crossbow bolt. The game changed with the adoption of the blast furnace, a technology that migrated from China to Europe and found its epicenter in regions like northern Italy and the Rhineland. The blast furnace could liquefy iron, allowing for the separation of slag and the controlled introduction of carbon. This was the birth of consistent steel production on a semi-industrial scale. Dr. Alan Williams conducted metallographic analyses on hundreds of surviving armor specimens for his monumental study, The Knight and the Blast Furnace. His findings shattered the notion of uniform armor quality. He identified a hierarchy of materials that dictated survival rates on the battlefield. At the bottom was wrought iron, with a Vickers hardness of roughly 100 to 180. In the middle was air-cooled steel, which was harder but inconsistent. At the top was full-quenched steel, material rapidly cooled in water or oil to freeze the crystalline structure into martensite. This is a super-hard phase of steel that could register a hardness of 350 to 600 Vickers. The effectiveness of a knight's armor depended heavily on the geography of his armorer. The masters of Milan, such as the famous Masaglia family, favored a deep surface hardening. They would quench the steel to achieve high hardness, making the surface incredibly resistant to being gouged or bitten by a blade. A Milanese breastplate from the mid-15th century might register a hardness of 450 Vickers or more. This hardness allowed the armor to be made thinner and lighter while offering superior protection. A 2mm plate of hardened Milanese steel offered the same protection as a 4mm plate of soft wrought iron, but at half the weight. Conversely, the German centers of Augsburg and Innsbruck took a different approach. They recognized that extremely hard steel could be brittle and prone to shattering like glass under a heavy impact. The German masters, like the Helmschmieds who armed the Holy Roman Emperors, practiced slack quenching or precise tempering. They would harden the steel and then reheat it to a specific temperature to draw back some of the hardness in exchange for toughness. This produced a metal that was hard enough to turn a blade, but tough enough to absorb the shock of a mace or a lance without cracking. This metallurgical divergence created a stark inequality on the battlefield. We often read accounts of arrows hailing down and penetrating the thigh armor and breastplate. Other accounts describe arrows bouncing harmlessly off knights who bowed their heads into the storm. Both accounts are likely factually correct, occurring simultaneously on the same field. The wealthy nobility, wearing bespoke hardened steel from Milan or Augsburg, were effectively immune to the longbow at range. Their armor was hard enough that arrow points would very likely deform upon impact rather than bite, leaving knights bruised the next day, but otherwise unharmed. However, the vast majority of combatants couldn't afford such masterpieces. They wore armor often made of wrought iron or poor quality air-cooled steel. Cost records from the 15th century illuminate this divide. A full Milanese breastplate alone cost 1 year of highly skilled labor and wages in northern Italy. Simply put, this state-of-the-art equipment was out of reach even for many lower members of the nobility. If the first myth of armor is that it was all the same, the second myth is that it rendered the wearer immobile. The image of the knight who needs a crane to mount his horse, or who lies helpless like a turtle on his back, is a fabrication of 19th century satirists and Hollywood directors. The reality of biomechanics in the late medieval period paints a picture of surprising agility, balanced by a significant metabolic tax. Plate armor wasn't a solid shell, but rather a system of articulated pieces connected by sliding rivets and internal leatherwork. This design mimicked the exoskeleton of a crustacean, allowing the plates to collapse and expand with the movement of the body. A well-fitted suit of 15th century armor, known as a harness, allowed for nearly the full range of human motion. Historical sources and modern reconstructions demonstrate that a man in full harness could perform a wide variety of athletic actions. They could mount a horse without stirrups, perform a somersault or cartwheel, climb a ladder, sprint for short distances, and stand up from a prone position in seconds. The myth of the knight being horsed via a crane likely comes from a misunderstanding of tournament armor versus field armor. In the 16th century, specialized armor for the joust was indeed extremely heavy and restrictive, sometimes locking the neck and left arm in place for safety. But this was sports equipment, not combat gear. Judging field effectiveness by jousting armor is akin to judging a modern soldier's combat mobility by looking at football equipment. While the knight was mobile, he wasn't fully unaffected. The weight of a full field harness ranged from 45 to 65 pounds. This is actually less than the combat load of a modern infantryman, which can exceed 100 pounds. The relationship between the English longbow and plate armor is one of the most debated topics in military history. The traditional narrative holds that the longbow ended the age of the knight. The evidence, however, suggests that plate armor was actually a highly successful response to the longbow, and for decades, it won the argument. For an arrow to eliminate an armored man, it must pierce the plate, penetrate the padding underneath, and enter the body with enough energy to cause a lethal wound. Experiments using war bows and varying qualities of plate has shown that this is incredibly difficult against high-quality armor. Against a Milanese breastplate of hardened steel, the arrow point is often softer than the armor. Upon impact, the energy isn't spent penetrating the plate. Instead, the arrow tip shatters or curls, and the arrow bounces off. Another factor that makes the comparison to modern tanks particularly appropriate is that armor designers relied on an advanced understanding of geometry. The shape of the breastplate and the sharp angles of the helmet were designed to ensure that an arrow almost never struck at a perpendicular angle. If an arrow strikes a plate at a 60-degree angle, the effective thickness of the metal doubles. A 2 mm plate behaves like a 4 mm plate. Furthermore, the smooth, polished surface of white armor encouraged the point to skid. A skidding arrow dissipates its energy laterally rather than driving it into the target. This is why the crease or stop rib on some breastplates existed, to catch a sliding point before it skidded up into the throat. Of course, I know some of you are thinking that if this armor was so good, how does one explain the French disaster at Agincourt? The answer lies in volume and probability. A single arrow might not penetrate a breastplate, but 50,000 arrows raining down creates a statistical certainty of finding a weak point. The armor wasn't uniform. While the breastplate and helmet were thick and hard, the limb defenses were often thinner to save weight. The joints were covered only by mail or the gambeson. The primary effect of the arrow storm was likely suppression. To protect their faces, knights had to lower their heads, which blinded them. The constant hammering of arrows against the plate was physically battering and psychologically terrifying. It forced the knights to bunch together for mutual protection, leading to the fatal crush. Moreover, the horse was the Achilles' heel. Even if the knight was invulnerable, his mount was not. Once the horse was shot, the knight fell. A fallen knight in deep mud, exhausted from the campaign as a whole in the heat, was vulnerable not to arrows, but to a knife through the visor. Joan of Arc offers a documented case of armor's protective value. At Orléans, she was struck by an arrow in the area between the neck and shoulder, a classic gap. The arrow penetrated, but it was merely a flesh wound. She was back in the fight days later. At Jargeau, a stone projectile hit her helmet, splitting it, but she survived. Without the armor, these hits would have been instant fatalities. The armor converted lethal kinetic events into survivable injuries. The effectiveness of plate armor was so profound that it forced a complete rewriting of martial arts manuals. The shield, which had been the soldier's primary defense for millennia, virtually disappeared among the heavily armored class by the mid-15th century. This is the ultimate testament to the armor's reliability. You don't throw away your shield unless you trust your breastplate with your life. With the left hand freed from the shield, soldiers adopted massive two-handed weapons designed to overcome the protection they faced. The poleaxe became a popular knightly weapon, something that was allowed only by the literal dropping of the shield. It combined a hammer face to deliver concussive shock, a heavy spike to pierce the plate, and a fluke to hook legs and trip the opponent. The halberd and the two-handed sword also rose to prominence, used not for slashing, which was useless against plate, but as levers and thrusting tools. German and Italian fight books detail specific techniques for fighting in armor, known as Harnischfechten. One such technique was half-swording, where the fighter would grip his own sword blade with his left hand to use the sword like a short spear. This allowed for precise, powerful thrusts aimed at the gaps, the eye slits, the armpits, the groin, and the palms of the hands. Another technique was the Mordhau, where the fighter would invert the sword, holding it by the blade and striking the opponent with the heavy pommel or crossguard. This turned the sword into a makeshift mace, delivering blunt force trauma to concuss the enemy through his helmet. Combat often devolved into grappling. If you couldn't penetrate the armor, you had to throw the opponent to the ground. Once he was pinned, you could draw a dagger and finish him through the visor or the armpit. That said, in general, if your opponent was wearing an expensive suit of armor, your goal was to capture and ransom him, not to finish him off. The next obvious question is that if plate armor was so effective, what was the cause of its decline? The answer isn't that guns made armor useless overnight. In fact, armor and guns coexisted for over 300 years. The decline was a slow, agonizing process of economic and physical exhaustion. As firearms like the arquebus and the musket became common in the 16th century, armorers responded by thickening the steel. They began to proof their armor by firing a pistol or musket at the breastplate at close range to demonstrate its quality. The dent left by the bullet was often circled by the armorer as a badge of honor, which is the origin of the term bulletproof. However, the physics of gunpowder scaled much faster than the metallurgy of steel. To stop a heavy musket ball moving at supersonic speeds, a breastplate had to be increasingly thick. In the 15th century, a breastplate might be 2 millimeters thick and weigh 5 pounds. By the 17th century, a proofed breastplate might be 6 millimeters thick and weigh 20 pounds. The armor worked, as it could stop the bullet, but the cost was mobility. A full suit of armor for the entire body would weigh over 90 pounds, rendering the soldier combat ineffective due to fatigue. Their response wasn't to ditch highly effective plate armor, but to discard the pieces of plate that were the least vital to defense. First, the greaves were abandoned in favor of heavy leather boots. Then the arm defenses were dropped for much lighter equivalents. By the early 17th century, only the heavy cavalry, the cuirassiers, wore armor, and it was reduced to a 3/4 harness. The infantry, who had to march, abandoned armor entirely in favor of mobility and firepower. As armies grew from feudal levies of a few thousand to state armies of tens of thousands, the cost of equipping every soldier with steel armor became prohibitive. It was cheaper to equip a man with a wool coat and a musket than a 10-pound suit of armor that he would likely throw away on a long march. History is often written by the victors, but the dead tell no lies. Modern forensic anthropology has provided chilling insights into the effectiveness and failure of armor. The discovery of King Richard III's remains under a car park in Leicester provided a unique opportunity to audit a king's armor. Richard was cut down at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. The skeletal analysis revealed that Richard suffered multiple severe injuries to the skull, including a slice off the back of the head and a thrust through the base of the skull. This suggests his helmet was forcibly removed or lost in the melee. Crucially, there were almost no defensive wounds on his arms or hands, and no damage to the ribs or spine. The conclusion is that his armor worked perfectly. It protected his torso and limbs during the fighting. He only died when he was unhorsed, surrounded, and his head protection was compromised. Plate armor was highly effective and turned the wearer into a highly mobile tank on the battlefield. It didn't make men immortal, but for 300 years, it fundamentally broke the balance of power between offense and defense. It forced the invention of new weapons. It forced the abandonment of the shield. It turned lethal arrows into bruises and fatal slashes into glancing scratches. The late medieval knight was a mobile, lethal, armored fighting vehicle powered by human muscle. He could run, jump, and climb. He could wade through a storm of arrows that would have annihilated a Roman legion. The demise of plate armor wasn't a failure of design, but a failure of physics against the immense chemical energy of gunpowder. Even today, soldiers wear ceramic plates in their vests to stop bullets. The materials have changed, but the goal is the same: to make sure the warrior is a survivor as well. Hey everyone, before we go on, just hitting you with a quick reminder to hit that subscribe button and notification bell if you haven't done so already. Also, consider buying a YouTube membership or joining the Patreon if you want to take your support for my work to the next level. History is often written by the victors, but legend has a way of belonging to the defeated. In the dark, dense woodlands of 16th century Germany, a nobleman rode not with his peers, but against them. He carried a sword that, according to enduring myth, bore a scratching on its blade that read, Nulla crux, nulla corona, no cross, no crown. This was Florian Geyer, a high-born diplomat who chose to lead an army of peasants, a man who burned the castles of his cousins to free the serfs from servitude. To understand Geyer is to look into the fractured soul of the German Reformation. He personifies a moment when the medieval order was cracking under the weight of gunpowder, printing presses, and a radical new theology that whispered of equality. Florian Geyer von Giebelstadt wasn't born to radicalism to any degree. He was born to some of the highest tiers of privilege. Entering the world around 1490 at his family's ancestral seat, Giebelstadt Castle in Lower Franconia, he belonged to the Reichsritterschaft, the imperial knighthood. These were not the high princes who ruled vast territories like Saxony or Bavaria, but the lower nobility who answered only to the Holy Roman Emperor. They were a proud martial class, but one that was slowly dying. The rise of centralized princely states and the inflation of the 16th century were squeezing the knights into irrelevance. This fostered a deep resentment against both the powerful territorial princes and the wealthy Catholic clergy who were completely exempt from taxation. Geyer, however, was no rustic robber baron. He was a man of the world. Before the drums of war began to beat, he carved out a successful career as a diplomat and military advisor. Records place him in the service of Casimir, Margrave of Brandenburg-Kulmbach, and later Albrecht, Duke of Brandenburg-Prussia. His skills were such that he was entrusted with delicate negotiations to end the Polish-Teutonic War in 1521, a conflict that had ravaged the eastern frontiers of the empire. He traveled to foreign courts, potentially even to England, and moved in circles that exposed him to the humanist current sweeping the continent. Crucially, in 1523, Geyer traveled to Wittenberg. There, in the epicenter of the Protestant Reformation, he likely met Martin Luther. While many nobles saw Luther's break with Rome as a convenient excuse to seize church lands, Geyer seems to have absorbed the movement's deeper, more dangerous implications. If all men were priests in the eyes of God, as Luther preached, by what right did a bishop or a count hold the power of life and death over a farmer? This question would eventually lead Geyer to trade his diplomat's quill for a rebel's sword. The explosion came in 1524. It began, as legends often say, with a trivial indignity, a countess in the Black Forest demanding peasants stop their harvest. This powerful ruler, according to the lore, ordered these peasants to collect snail shells for her jewelry, rather than the food to provide for their families. Whether fact or fiction, this incident, or something similar, ignited a powder keg of grievances in the region. By early 1525, the uprising had engulfed Swabia and Franconia in what is now southeastern Germany. The rebels weren't merely rioting, they were organizing something bigger, and perhaps hoping to achieve something like the peasants in Dithmarschen had done. In northern Germany, there were a number of peasant republics, which were nominally owned by a noble or a bishop, but which in actuality were completely self-governing. While it's not clear if this precedence was an influence, it's highly likely someone like Florian Geyer would have been aware of these plucky peasant polities. The rebels produced the 12 Articles, a manifesto demanding the abolition of serfdom, the right to elect pastors, and the restoration of communal hunting and fishing rights. Into this chaos rode Florian Geyer. He arrived in the imperial city of Rothenburg ob der Tauber, not to suppress the revolt, but to join it. He utilized his military experience to forge a unit that would become legendary, the Schwarzer Haufen, or Black Company. The name itself was a statement. The main peasant armies were often called the Light Heap or Company, implying a vast mass of troops. Geyer's Black Company, or ironically Heap, signaled elite status and perhaps a darker, more solemn purpose. Comprising roughly 600 men, the unit was a mix of radicalized but well-off peasants, professional soldiers, and impoverished knights, some of whom were Geyer's own vassals. Unlike the chaotic mobs armed with flails, the Black Company was disciplined. Geyer drilled them in tactics and forbade looting for personal gain. They became the shock troops of the Franconian Rebellion, and the only time in European history that a peasant rebellion ever fielded heavy cavalry. Their strategy was brutal but effective. They targeted the fortified castles and monasteries that served as the power bases of the nobility. Geyer's men moved through the Neckar Valley and the Odenwald, burning strongholds to deny them to the enemy. It was a campaign of scorched stone. They forced powerful lords to swear allegiance to the 12 Articles, turning the feudal hierarchy upside down. To their enemies, this inversion was a challenge to the natural order that God himself had ordained for the world, making these rebels heretical on a number of different levels. However, fissures soon appeared within the rebel leadership. Geyer was a radical who believed in the total restructuring of the empire. He found himself at odds with other leaders like Götz von Berlichingen, the famous Knight with the Iron Hand, a mercenary who had joined the peasants under duress. While Götz negotiated, Geyer burned. He understood that there could be no return to the status quo. They had to win, or they would die. The dream of a peasant republic began to collapse in May 1525. The Swabian League, a military alliance of princes and cities, mobilized a professional army under Georg Truchsess von Waldburg. With loads of heavy cavalry and superior artillery, von Waldburg began to dismantle the rebel armies piecemeal. The end for the Black Company came at the Battle of Ingolstadt, not the famous Bavarian fortress city, but a smaller town in Lower Franconia. The details of the engagement paint a picture of desperate courage. Geyer's men occupied the ruins of a church and castle, fortifying themselves against the Swabian League's advance. They repelled 2 assaults, their arquebuses holding back the professional Landsknechte infantry. But courage is no match for cannon fire. The League brought up heavy siege guns, breaching the walls and burying the defenders in rubble. The Black Company was annihilated. Geyer, however, was not among the dead at Ingolstadt. Accounts vary on why. Some say he had been separated from the main body while on a reconnaissance or diplomatic mission to Rothenburg. Others suggest he was waiting for an escort that never arrived. Regardless of the circumstance, he found himself a general without an army, a nobleman who had betrayed his birth, and a fugitive with a price on his head. In the aftermath of the defeat, the hunt for the rebel leaders was merciless. Thousands were executed, blinded, or worse. Geyer, knowing he could expect no quarter, went on the lam. On the night of June 9, 1525, he was riding near Würzburg, seeking refuge or perhaps a way to rekindle the dying embers of the insurrection. It was here that he made a fatal error. He trusted his own family. Geyer made contact with servants belonging to his brother-in-law, Wilhelm von Grumbach. Grumbach is one of the era's most colorful and nefarious villains, a man who would later be executed for orchestrating the assassination of a bishop. As an interesting footnote, this bishop's family would end up inheriting the Geyer family's large estates a couple centuries later. In 1525, however, he was merely a scheming knight looking to survive the political storm and perhaps ingratiate himself to more powerful lords while collecting vast quantities of loot. The servants met Geyer in the Gramschatz forest, a dense woodland north of Würzburg. They claimed they were there to escort him to safety. Instead, deep in the woods, they turned on him. Florian Geyer was stabbed to death on the morning of June 10th, 1525. The theories surrounding his death speak to the treacherous nature of the time. Geyer likely carried the last of the Black Company's war chest, making him a walking fortune. Grumbach also must have known that delivering the corpse of the noble turned peasant leader would make him a hero to the nobility and the clergy. Florian Geyer's direct physical line ended with him as he was still fairly young and had no children. The Geyer family as a whole eventually went extinct in the early 18th century. But despite this, his spiritual legacy took on a rather bizarre and contradictory life of its own. In the 19th century, Friedrich Engels, the co-author of the Communist Manifesto, resurrected Geyer from obscurity. In his work, The Peasant War in Germany, Engels painted Geyer as a proto-communist revolutionary, a class traitor who recognized the economic engines of history. This interpretation became state dogma in East Germany, where border regiments and schools were named after him, celebrating him as a hero of the proletariat. Yet, paradoxically, Geyer was also embraced by the Third Reich, who saw him as a nationalist leader. He is perhaps the only figure who had divisions of the Third Reich and of Communist Germany named after him. It's a strange irony that a man who fought for freedom from tyranny became a totem for two of the 20th century's most totalitarian regimes. Today, stripped of the ideological baggage of later centuries, Florian Geyer stands as a tragic figure of the transition from the medieval to the modern world. He was a man caught between the gears of history. His sword inscription, Nulla Crux, Nulla Corona, whether real or apocryphal, captures the essence of his struggle. It was a rejection of the corrupt hierarchies that dominated his time and strangled the potential of his people. He wasn't a saint by any means, and his Black Company brought fire and ruin to Franconia. But in an age of religious fanaticism and princely greed, he remains a compelling anomaly. Florian Geyer was an imperial knight who looked down from his castle walls, saw the suffering of those in the fields, and decided to open the gates. The betrayal in the Gramschatz forest silenced his voice, but it ensured that his legend would echo loudly enough to be heard 500 years later. The Portuguese Golden Age of exploration expanded Europe's reach to the edges of Asia, changing the course of world history. In 1543, two Portuguese explorers, Antonio Mota and Francisco Zé Moto, made history by becoming the first Europeans to reach Japan. Their unintended arrival on Japanese shores catalyzed a chain of events that would leave a lasting mark on Japanese society, particularly through the introduction of the arquebus. This weapon would very rapidly completely reshape the nature of warfare in Japan, much as it had done in other parts of the world. Antonio Mota and Francisco Zé Moto were likely typical of the Portuguese explorers of their era. Though we can't know for certain, they were likely motivated by a combination of economic opportunity and the chance to navigate uncharted waters. Mota and Zé Moto embarked from Siam, modern-day Thailand, traveling aboard a Chinese junk bound for Ningbo, a prominent Chinese trade port. A severe storm, however, altered their course, and instead of China, they landed on the shores of Tanegashima, a small island south of Kyushu, Japan's third largest island. Accounts indicate that the journey was marked by hardships, including the loss of a fellow sailor who did not survive the voyage. Nonetheless, the arrival of Mota and Zé Moto with their Chinese companions marked the beginning of European-Japanese relations. The relationship between the Portuguese and the Japanese would completely change the socio-political landscape of Japan over the next century. Also, it's important to briefly mention another claimant to the title of the first European in Japan, Fernão Mendes Pinto. He had a significant impact on facilitating early trade with Japan. However, most historians do not view his account of his arrival in Japan as accurate. He claimed that he arrived in Japan with Mota and Zeimoto. However, his own memoirs contradict themselves, and he indicated that he was in Burma at the same time. In essence, it appears that he took the factual story of Mota and Zeimoto and claimed it for his own in his memoirs. But let's get back to Mota and Zeimoto. The Japanese greeted these newcomers with a mixture of curiosity and caution, as may be expected. Europeans, with their strange clothing and unfamiliar appearance, were seen as Nanban, or Southern barbarians. The term is originally derived from the Chinese term Nanman, which was originally used for tribal people from southern China in antiquity. Nanban was used by the Japanese to label people from regions to their south who did not adhere to Japanese customs. However, it generally became a term for most foreigners, aside from Koreans and Chinese, with whom the Japanese of the period had a great deal of familiarity. Zeimoto and Mota, on the other hand, initially assumed that the Japanese locals they found were actually Chinese. The arrival of the Portuguese also brought a previously unseen kind of vessel, the Chinese junk modified with Portuguese fittings, which aroused immediate interest. Zeimoto and Mota's distinct appearance and their unfamiliar language made a profound and immediate impression. These two curiosities were soon summoned by Tanegashima Tokitaka, the young daimyo, or feudal lord, of the island. And when I say young here, Tokitaka was only 15 years old and potentially more open to new and exciting ideas and technologies. Tokitaka's curiosity about these strange men quickly turned to fascination when he noticed they carried a unique piece of equipment, the arquebus. Unlike traditional Japanese weapons, the arquebus could project lethal force across considerable distances, something the daimyo had never encountered. Recognizing the potential of this technology, Tokitaka requested a demonstration. According to historical accounts, when a shot was fired, the thunderous sound and visible impact left the daimyo and his retinue in awe. This encounter led Tokitaka to acquire 2 arquebuses at an extremely high price, and he wasted no time in commissioning his own craftsmen to reproduce them. Japanese swordsmiths, while skilled in metalwork, initially struggled to replicate the intricate mechanisms of the arquebus. This challenge prompted Tokitaka to invite a Portuguese blacksmith to Tanegashima to aid in the manufacturing process. The Portuguese blacksmith arrived in 1544, and crucially, instead of being used to simply produce the weapons, Tokitaka had him teach his local craftsmen to make the weapons. By 1544, Japan had successfully begun its journey to indigenous firearm production, with the locally made guns becoming known as Tanegashima after the island. Notably, the Tanegashima arquebus would be innovated upon until complete consolidation of Japan by the Tokugawa clan after the siege of Osaka in 1615. After this point, the arquebus remained in use until the 19th century, as Japan enjoyed a period of approximately 250 years of near-complete peace. After Antonio Mota and Francisco Zeimoto's landmark arrival in Japan, historical records diverge somewhat on their exact fates. The limited available information suggests that after the initial Tanegashima encounter, the explorers continued their maritime activities. The scholarly consensus appears to be that it's most likely they returned to various Portuguese trading outposts across Asia. However, precise details of their later lives remain unclear, as documentation is sparse. Personally, I like to speculate that they may have leveraged their connections in Japan to further conduct Japanese trade. However, it's important to state that this is just speculation. However, I do believe this makes sense, as the men appear to have stayed some period of time in Japan and were by definition the most well-versed Europeans in Japanese customs. This understanding of Japanese custom may have been important in establishing the coming lucrative trade with the Japanese. But before we discuss that any further, it's necessary to discuss how the arquebus completely revolutionized Japanese warfare. The introduction of the arquebus had transformative effects on Japanese society, particularly during the Sengoku period. While the exact definition of this period is beyond the scope of this video, this was a period in the 15th and 16th century where rival daimyo constantly battled for control over land. Firearms quickly spread across Japan, with various feudal lords recognizing the advantage they offered in battle. The arquebus became a decisive tool, particularly in the hands of Oda Nobunaga, a major feudal lord who would eventually initiate Japan's unification. Nobunaga famously deployed arquebuses on a large scale during the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, arranging them in rows to fire in volleys. This volley firing pattern was similar to methods worked out in European theaters of war and had the exact same effect. The volley fire proved capable of overwhelming his opponents, which in turn changed Japanese warfare forever. Notably, there's some dispute over whether the Oda forces invented this technique independently or whether they were influenced by Portuguese or Spanish tactics. By the late 16th century, Japan was one of the most well-armed countries in the world, with more firearms than many European nations. This development set Japan apart, as it was one of the few non-European nations to master firearm production at scale during this period. Notably, this mastery over firearms production by the end of the 16th century likely drastically reduced the chance of Japan dominated by any European powers. Moda and Zeimoto's arrival on Japanese shores heralded the beginning of a complex relationship between Japan and Portugal that extended beyond technology. The Portuguese established a lucrative trade network in Japan, exchanging goods such as Chinese silk, pottery, and sugar in return for silver, one of Japan's most valuable resources. This trade soon became part of the broader Nanban trade, which connected Japan to the rest of the world through Portuguese and Spanish intermediaries. With Portuguese merchants came Catholic missionaries, most notably the Jesuits, who sought to convert the Japanese to Christianity. Figures like Francis Xavier, who arrived in 1549, began spreading Christianity in Japan, attracting many followers among the Japanese nobility. These missionaries not only introduced religious ideas, but also facilitated the exchange of knowledge in areas like cartography, medicine, and astronomy. Jesuit schools introduced Western science and education to Japan, creating an environment where cultural exchange went beyond mere trade. The arrival of Portuguese explorers and missionaries fundamentally altered Japanese society, bringing new goods, technologies, and ideologies. This period of interaction, although short-lived, left an indelible mark on Japan. The Japanese eventually chose to adopt some aspects of Western technology, including firearms, while rejecting other aspects of Western culture. This eventually culminated in the expulsion of most Western influence through restrictive policies, culminating in the Sakoku, or closed country policy, in the early 17th century. This was so restrictive that for over 200 years, only the Dutch were allowed any trade with Japan. Western influence was viewed with such caution that the Dutch were forced to conduct their trade from an artificial island off Nagasaki called Dejima. That said, the extremely lucrative nature of the trade ensured that the tradition of Western trade, which began with the accidental arrival of Antonio Moda and Francisco Zeimoto, continued. You're hiking deep in the Japanese countryside, far from any paved road, when you stumble upon a snake unlike any you've ever seen. It's too thick, its body swelling to the size of a bread loaf or a bottle. Before you can react, this reptile stands vertically on its tail, takes an impossible 15-foot leap toward you, and then, inexplicably, rolls away like a wheel. This is the Tsuchinoko, perhaps Japan's most sought-after and biologically confusing cryptid, a being that defies conventional biology yet commands national attention. For centuries, it has captured the national imagination, prompting serious expeditions and large bounties from legitimate institutions. To understand why this creature maintains such a powerful hold on modern Japan, it's necessary to explore its deep historical roots and discuss what witnesses have seen. The creature's identity is inextricably linked to its distinctive shape. Unlike a typical snake that tapers gradually, the Tsuchinoko is described as having a long body, but with a center girth dramatically wider than its head or tail. The sheer proliferation of regional names across Japan speaks to the widespread nature of the phenomenon. While Tsuchinoko is the dominant term in Western Japan, it's known by over 50 different aliases nationwide. My personal favorite regional variant is Tsuchikorobi, which literally translates to tumbles in the dirt. The fact that geographically disparate regions independently developed unique names for the creature suggests something fundamental. There may have been something consistently observable that has been encountered for generations. Unlike many cryptid-type creatures, the mythological lineage of this supposed animal is ancient, stretching back to the Jomon period over 2,500 years ago. Pottery and stone tools feature motifs resembling stumpy snakes, establishing that this unusual form has been part of Japanese cultural memory for millennia. Compounding the mystery, folklore dictates several features that fundamentally distinguish the Tsuchinoko from true snakes. It's consistently reported to possess eyelids, a trait absent in most serpents but present in lizards. Furthermore, observers across different eras agree that the creature is highly venomous, bearing fangs similar to a viper, which reinforces its dangerous reputation. Witnesses recount a series of movement patterns that defy known herpetological mechanics. It reportedly moves in an inchworm fashion, can roll sideways like a log, or even tumble end over end. Its speed is often cited as astonishing, leaving observers baffled by its rapid disappearance. The most sensational descriptions involve two specific behaviors. First is its extraordinary agility, especially its jumping capability, which is said to cover distances of up to 15 feet. According to some accounts, it even appears to have unlocked a double jump ability, leaping again while airborne. The other is, of course, its purported ability to swallow its own tail and form a rigid loop that allows it to roll away at great speed. Beyond its bizarre movements, the lore assigns the Tsuchinoko a peculiar personality. It's said to produce a sharp, squealing sound, and is even reported to snore loudly while it slumbers. Adding an element of comedy, legend claims it can speak. Unfortunately, everything it says is a lie, unless you get it drunk, at which point it becomes compelled to tell the truth. But it won't just drink any swill you toss in front of it. This snake demands high-quality rice wine. The Tsuchinoko transitioned into a national obsession during the late 1980s, when a wave of purported sightings erupted across Japan. In 1988, one local government launched a formal Tsuchinoko expedition to prove the creature's existence in their region. This wasn't just an idle way of drumming up tourist dollars. They actually funded zoologists to search for the animal, though as you may have guessed, they slithered back up empty-handed. Or perhaps in this situation, maybe they contorted themselves into hoops and rolled back. The officials then launched a campaign to reward any independent snake hunters who could capture a live specimen. The initial reward was the equivalent of $8,000 in 1988, but over the years this amount has grown substantially. At present, the reward for capturing the creature alive and unharmed sits at 20 million yen, or about $125,000. So if you're planning on doing a trip to Japan anytime soon, you may want to swing by a Tsuchinoko-rich area in hopes of funding your travels, and then some. While it's generally accepted by everyone at this point that the creature is more folklore than fact, the ancient and widespread nature of the tale has attracted significant theories. For biologists, the task is to rationalize the Tsuchinoko's reported shape and behavior using known fauna. The prevailing theories generally fall into two categories: misidentification of native species and confusion with escaped exotic pets. The first, most immediate explanation involves the misidentification of native Japanese venomous snakes. These species are common in the alleged habitats and are known to cause human fatalities, rationally explaining the consistent reports of viper-like fangs and potent venom. However, neither of these native snakes possesses the extreme girth reported by witnesses to be consistent across centuries. They also don't snore or roll up into a hoop, and though I haven't been able to confirm this, I'm fairly certain they don't drink or speak any human languages. The most compelling modern hypothesis concerns the blue-tongued skink. This reptile, native to Australia and Indonesia, is frequently kept in the exotic pet trade worldwide. Crucially, the skink offers a near-perfect physical match to the Tsuchinoko's core attribute. It is short, thick, distinctively wide-bodied, and has a noticeably separate head and tail. The chronological alignment of this animal's introduction to Japan provides the strongest supporting evidence for this theory. Blue-tongued skinks first entered the Japanese pet market in the 1970s, which directly preceded the explosive wave of sightings that peaked in the late 1980s. As intelligent reptiles with long lifespans, escaped skinks could easily establish persistent small populations. From there, they could startle observers who mistakenly identified them with the mythological Tsuchinoko. And if you're one of those people who just listen, take a look at this creature and imagine it's in the tall grass where you can't see its stubby little legs. To me, it looks virtually identical to the descriptions of the Tsuchinoko, especially at a quick glance. My own theory is that someone a couple millennia ago encountered a native viper mid-digestion, its body grotesquely swollen around a recent meal. In poor light, the proportions would look wrong, almost impossible, and fear would do the rest. That single image, a fat, dangerous snake frozen in memory, could seed a story that spread, mutated, and hardened into folklore. Over generations, each retelling exaggerated motion, speed, and intelligence, until the Tsuchinoko became something else. Then, in the late 20th century, the fuse was reignited. Escaped blue-tongued skinks, abandoned pets with stubby legs hidden in grass and thick bodies, matched the ancient description just well enough to validate the myth. Old stories met real escaped animals in belief, and a little bit of mass hysteria took hold and did the rest. Millions of Japanese citizens were watching their television sets on October 12, 1960, expecting a standard political skirmish. Instead, they became involuntary witnesses to an act of breathtaking violence. Inajiro Asanuma, the robust chairman of the Japan Socialist Party, stood at the podium in Tokyo's Hibiya Hall when the sterile formality of the televised debate was shattered. An assassin dashed onto the stage with a wakizashi, a shorter variant of the more commonly known katana, and cut Asanuma down live in front of the entire nation. Immediately after, the question of whether the assassin was a lone wolf or acting on orders of a shadowy group would rear its head. Before his sudden demise, Asanuma was by far the most polarizing figure in Japanese opposition politics. Known for his powerful oratory and commanding presence, he represented the apex of left-wing power, serving as the chairman of the Socialist Party. The political climate of 1960 was defined by the massive, often turbulent opposition to the revision of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. This was a period collectively known as the Anpo protests. Under Asanuma's leadership, the socialists had steered these protests so effectively that they successfully forced the resignation of powerful Prime Minister Nobusuke Kishi. This political victory made Asanuma a hero to the left, but simultaneously magnified the rage of the ultra-nationalist and far-right factions. These factions vehemently supported the American alliance and the treaty as essential for national security. These right-wing elements viewed the socialists' anti-treaty stance as fundamentally undermining the nation's core interests and sovereignty. The political tension was already at a breaking point, creating a volatile environment where symbolic actions were perceived as outright treason. Asanuma had deliberately inflamed this situation by choosing an aggressively provocative form of diplomacy. In 1959, he met with Chairman Mao and took a bunch of very friendly pictures with him. If you're one of those people who just listen, I've got a picture of the two men up on screen right now. While this picture itself might not look like much, this photograph, which was widely reprinted at the time, would be one of the most important pictures in post-war Japanese history. At the time, Japan, closely allied with the United States, recognized the Republic of China on Taiwan as the legitimate Chinese government. To directly meet with Communist China's leader was, for many on the right, proof that he was planning to abandon the Americans and embrace Red China. The assassination took place during a crucial joint political debate held at Hibiya Public Hall in Tokyo, intended to kick off the general campaigning for the upcoming elections. Rhetoric ran extremely high, with the election being viewed as a fight for the soul of Japan. The stage was crowded with high-profile figures from across the political spectrum. The purpose was to showcase the power of democratic discourse, but the atmosphere was already charged with hostility, reflecting the polarization gripping the country. And I think it's important for me to mention here that Japan was only about a decade into their democratic experiment at this point. Asanuma began his address just after 3 in the afternoon, using his deep, resonant voice to denounce the controversial security pact with the United States. Even as he spoke, members of the far right present in the crowd began shouting insults like, "Shut up, communist," and showering the stage with leaflets. Asanuma, accustomed to such confrontations, initially ignored the heckling and continued his remarks. Suddenly, a young man, only 17 years old, erupted onto the stage. He wore the standard high-collared black student uniform and boots. Things were about to get real. This kid wasn't coming to hurl insults or call Asanuma a Mao sympathizer like most of the others who had come to denounce him. Clutched in his hands, held in a two-handed samurai-style grip, was a wakizashi, a traditional short sword, its bayonet-like blade measuring about a foot in length. The choice of this archaic weapon was deeply symbolic. It was a powerful rejection of modern political methods and democracy. The assassin intended his act not merely as an assassination, but as a divine punishment, delivered by a patriotic warrior against democracy as an institution. The attack was captured live by the cameras broadcasting the event, which documented every terrifying moment. Also, if you've never seen this image before, this is another time you're going to want to look at the screen if you just listen rather than watch. I've had to slightly crop the image, so if you want to see the full thing, Google's your friend. The assailant, Otoya Yamaguchi, lunged into Asanuma's large frame, driving the blade deep into his lower abdomen and liver in a powerful collision. There was so much force behind this blow that it sent the politician's notes flying and knocked the glasses straight off his face. As Asanuma stumbled, his face contorted in agony, Yamaguchi recovered his grip and delivered a decisive second thrust into the politician's chest. Colleagues rushed forward to subdue the youth, but the gravely wounded socialist leader wobbled and then collapsed. He was immediately rushed to a hospital but tragically succumbed to his injuries on the operating table. The sheer violence of the event, broadcast live to millions, was instantly immortalized by the photograph captured by Yasushi Nagao. And in case there was any doubt, this is the image I have cropped and put up on the screen for you. The perpetrator, Otoya Yamaguchi, was a figure steeped in the volatile ultranationalism of the era, despite his youth. Influenced initially by his older brother, he began attending speeches and participating in the increasingly frequent right-wing counter-protests. By age 16, his commitment was formalized when he joined the Greater Japan Patriotic Party, led by the right-wing ultranationalist Bin Akao. Akao had a profound impact on the youth with his warnings about impending communist revolution, and promoted imagery of the People's Liberation Army in Tokyo. Yamaguchi was highly militant. Throughout the height of the Anpo crisis, he was arrested and released 10 times for his involvement in various counter-protests. This pattern of repeat engagement suggests a deeply rooted and rapidly intensifying ideological commitment. His stated motives for the attack were clear and uncompromising: a deep-seated opposition and resentment toward Asanuma's diplomatic overtures to Communist China. He also professed a strong desire to keep the status quo in relations with America, which again was seen as preventing the influence of the Soviets and Red China. Yamaguchi was convinced that his act was necessary to deter the spread of left-wing movements in Japan. Crucially, Yamaguchi strongly claimed he had grown increasingly disillusioned with Akao's leadership. He felt that the party focused too much on generating media attention rather than achieving meaningful, decisive action. This belief led him to a significant, calculated step. He formally resigned from the Greater Japan Patriotic Party just prior to the attack. In his later testimony to the police, the youth stated explicitly that he needed to be free of the party structure to take action. He then specifically said that Bin Akao would have specifically prevented him from carrying out the crime had he been aware of his plans. The assassination immediately triggered massive public suspicion regarding a wider political plot. For the Japan Socialist Party, the idea that a 17-year-old, acting completely unassisted, could organize and pull off the attack was unthinkable. The socialists quickly moved to control the narrative, framing it as an attack orchestrated by powerful, insidious forces aimed at destroying democracy. And this was a quote too good to pass up on, so here it is. One socialist leader condemned Yamaguchi as, quote, merely a cat's paw of monopolistic capitalistic forces. The socialists themselves would come to blame the ruling Liberal Democratic Party rather than the far right, based on an analysis of who benefited most. The circumstances certainly fueled these suspicions. The public correctly perceived a massive institutional security failure. The assassin was, after all, a known far-right activist. Yet despite this, he was able to successfully infiltrate a stage containing all of the nation's top political figures. Following the attack, demonstrators marched on police headquarters, demanding the resignation of the police chief and accusing him of providing inadequate security. Most protesters expressed the belief that the cops deliberately allowed him to step onto the stage. The subsequent battles between demonstrators and police only compounded the impression of a state that had either deliberately stood down or was incompetent in protecting the opposition. The political calculus of the era provided further circumstantial grounding for the conspiracy theory. The assassination occurred at the peak of the socialist influence in Japan, immediately following their success in forcing a prime minister's resignation over the security treaty. Removing Asanuma, who provided charismatic leadership, accelerated the internal fragmentation of the party and drastically damaged its ability to present a cohesive message. The Socialist Party's view that the ruling Liberal Democratic Party could have been in on the attack was, for a time, very popular. While this conspiracy theory has died on the vine over the years, for lack of any evidence whatsoever, a more interesting and realistic theory has taken hold. Historically, Far-right ultranationalist groups in Japan were often loosely connected with powerful conservative figures and corporate interests. In the period of rebuilding after 1945, they frequently served as tools for political intimidation against labor unions, or the left in general. Yamaguchi's deliberate decision to separate from his allegiances just prior to the attack may itself serve as evidence of coordinated involvement by far-right forces. Rather than undermining the conspiracy theory, his documented break with the organization could be interpreted as a calculated move to obscure direct connections. Yamaguchi's resignation may have been designed to create the appearance of an independent actor, free from organizational control. This apparent quest for ideological purity and autonomy can be seen as a sophisticated tactic to deflect suspicion and protect the interests of those who might have influenced his actions. Many have also considered it unusual how a 17-year-old who had just committed an extremist act was so insistent that he had no connections to anyone anymore. They also find it suspicious that he specifically said that the leaders of the ultranationalist party explicitly would have stopped him if he knew. What happened next would only deepen the idea that Yamaguchi wasn't acting alone. Less than 3 weeks after the attack, while confined in a Tokyo juvenile detention facility, Otoya Yamaguchi ensured his own narrative reached its desired dramatic conclusion. The 17-year-old assassin was discovered dead in his cell. He had torn strips from his own bedsheet and knotted them into a rope and had apparently ended himself, despite the fact he was under constant watch. Not to turn everything into American politics or anything, but that sounds really topical right now. Yamaguchi left behind a final, chilling declaration scrawled onto the cell wall. The message reaffirmed his ultimate loyalty. 7 lives for my country. 10,000 years for His Imperial Majesty, the Emperor. By invoking the phrase 7 lives, this references a legendary samurai's pledge of continuous reincarnation to serve the Emperor over and over again. By doing this, Yamaguchi powerfully linked his act to the ideals of patriotic sacrifice and devotion to the imperial throne. In this act of eliminating himself, he avoided a protracted investigation which may have revealed the full extent of his political backing. In the wake of Asanuma's sudden violent death, the Japan Socialist Party struggled desperately to maintain coherence and momentum. The loss of his robust and experienced leadership created a vacuum that proved impossible to fill. His successor quickly attempted to steer the party toward a more centrist platform, in a move that fed into the conspiracy theories swirling about. This rapid doctrinal shift alienated the revolutionary socialist and communist elements within the party, resulting in severe and damaging infighting. The assassination, regardless of whether it was ordered by shadowy figures behind the scenes or not, proved strategically fatal for the opposition. Over the decades that followed, the Socialist Party's influence steadily diminished, a decline that continued relentlessly until the party's ultimate extinction in 1996. On a moonless night with the sea like glass, a lone sailor suddenly sees a colossal black humanoid shape rising from the depths. 2 huge eyes, glowing in the darkness, glare from a bulbous bald head as a sudden squall erupts around his boat. This is no normal storm. It's the wrath of an umebozu, the legendary sea monk of Japan's oceans. For centuries, Japanese mariners have whispered about this malevolent sea spirit whose appearance in calm waters foretells disaster. The umebozu was first documented in the 17th century. Its name is inspired by a round, shaved head resembling a Buddhist monk's head. In countless coastal legends, the umebozu is described as a massive black humanoid figure rising from the ocean, usually visible only from the waist up. It has a mostly featureless form with only 2 large, staring eyes on its face. The creature can tower over 30 feet tall, easily dwarfing fishing boats and smashing them to splinters if angered. Edo period artists even portrayed the umebozu in woodblock prints confronting sailors, cementing its fearsome reputation. No single folkloric origin story exists for this entity, but several ideas circulate in the lore. One suggests it's the vengeful spirit of a drowned monk cast into the ocean depths, transformed into an angry sea ghost. Others interpret it as the embodiment of the ocean's wrath, or a punishment from sea deities when humans disrespect the natural order. Other tales were more localized, and by the 1800s, nearly every Japanese fishing community had its own umebozu origin tale that reflected local realities. Stories of umebozu encounters are invariably ominous. The creature typically appears on eerily calm nights, its sudden emergence causing winds to howl and waves to crash out of nowhere. Fishermen would find a gigantic black head looming over their vessel before chaos strikes. In many accounts, the umebozu demands a barrel from the crew, a request that heralds doom. If given a container, the monster uses it to hurl seawater into the boat, flooding the hull until the ship capsizes. Legends say the only hope for survival is to hand over a bottomless barrel. Unable to scoop water with a barrel that has no bottom, the confused umebozu can be stalled, buying sailors time to escape while it struggles with the useless container. This trick appears in many folk tales as the sole way to outsmart the otherwise invincible creature. Over time, many explanations have been proposed for what the umebozu really is. Some folklorists interpret the umebozu as a cautionary myth. It personifies the sea's anger and divine retribution, teaching sailors to respect the elements and follow maritime traditions, or else the ocean will take revenge. In this view, the legend served as a supernatural reminder to keep seafarers humble and vigilant. There are plausible natural phenomena behind these stories. Sudden rogue waves can strike on calm seas without warning, much like an umebozu attack. Notably, rogue waves themselves were once thought to be sailors' tales until modern evidence proved they exist. And when I say modern evidence here, I really do mean virtually contemporary evidence. Rogue waves were proven to exist in 1995. The ocean's depths hide large animals that, seen partially, might inspire monster legends. Giant squids or octopuses breaking the surface could be perceived as huge tentacled forms, and surfacing whales or enormous jellyfish might look like a black mass in the waves. Even in recent decades, fishermen have often described massive unknown creatures at sea, further fueling the umebozu legend. Under this theory, perhaps the umebozu could actually be an as yet undiscovered creature lurking the depths off the coast of Japan. Of course, none of this explains the supernatural element of the claim, or why a real sea creature would be asking for a barrel like it's handing out a quest in a video game. Of course, perhaps the umebozu just springs from the imagination of sailors under stress. It could be an ancient legend that gives a name and shape to the dread one feels when confronting the vast, dark ocean. Imagine walking alone on a misty mountain path in rural Japan. All is quiet until a strange, hunched figure emerges from the trees. Before you can even cry out, the creature speaks, and it's your voice, uttering the very thought that was forming in your mind. Such is the unnerving encounter with the Satori, a mysterious being of Japanese folklore said to read minds. In Japanese lore, the Satori is described as a monkey-like supernatural creature that dwells in remote mountain regions. Travelers trekking along lonely mountain paths, or woodcutters working at isolated forest huts, may encounter a Satori suddenly appearing on the trail. With its hunched, hairy form and unnervingly keen eyes, the creature's mere appearance is frightening, yet the Satori's most dreaded ability is even more unsettling. The hallmark of a Satori is its telepathic power to read human thoughts. It will instantly speak a person's thoughts aloud, often finishing your sentences before you do. This means the creature can anticipate every action. If you plan to run or to strike it, the Satori already knows, making it nearly impossible to catch by surprise. This psychological terror of having one's private thoughts exposed by a monster makes the Satori especially feared. Beyond its mind reading, the Satori is also known as a dangerous predator. Legends claim it will hunt humans for sport. However, folklore offers a clever defense against this menace. If a person can manage to do something truly unexpected, an action with no premeditation, it might startle the Satori and send it fleeing in fear. Better yet, the surefire way to survive a Satori encounter is to empty one's mind completely. With no thoughts to read, the mind-reading monster becomes confused or bored, and eventually wanders off. Of course, achieving such a zen-like state of no mind while facing a hungry cryptid is easier said than done, which is why most victims in the tales are not so lucky. The Satori's very name hints at its eerie role. In Japanese, Satori refers to sudden enlightenment, an ironic title for a wild mountain monster. Even the prescribed escape from a Satori, clearing one's mind entirely, mirrors Zen Buddhist practices of attaining inner stillness. In this way, the Satori legend doubles as a folk cautionary tale and a subtle spiritual lesson about the power of the ability to empty one's mind. Historically, the Satori entered written folklore during the Edo period, with the first documented recording of the creature coming in a 1712 encyclopedia. Folklorists have offered various interpretations of what the Satori really represents. One theory is that it started out as a mountain kami, a minor deity or spirit of the wild, that devolved into a yokai as people lost faith in the old nature gods. Another theory is that the creature grew out of a previous ghostly entity, which was said to haunt mountains and echo words back. For clarity's sake, a yokai is a supernatural entity from Japanese folklore, often described as spirits, demons, strange apparitions, or in modern times, as cryptids. They embody the mysterious, eerie, and sometimes playful aspects of the unseen world. Many interpretations of this creature are interwoven with Zen Buddhist lessons, and the stories may not be intended to be taken at face value. One of the most famous Satori legends tells of a lone woodcutter deep in the mountains who is stalked by the creature. Every time the woodcutter conceives a plan, whether to flee or to swing his axe, the Satori speaks his thought aloud in a mocking voice, thwarting any chance of surprise. Finally, in desperation, the man stops scheming and simply resumes chopping wood, trying to empty his mind. While he chops the wood, eventually the axe head breaks off and flies into the Satori, eliminating the ape creature on the spot. The tale's implicit moral is that only a truly empty mind can outwit the mind-reading Satori, mirroring the Zen teaching that stillness of mind can overcome even great obstacles. Folk traditions are generally less high-minded, and simply focus on the fact that the Satori wouldn't harm those who live and work respectfully in the mountains. In these stories, the creature preys mainly on outsiders, or people who look to exploit the mountain's riches, almost like a guardian spirit of the highlands, enforcing nature's rules. While the Satori is now largely regarded solely as a mythical being, this creature was once accepted as part of the order of the natural world. Interestingly, some have tried to tie the Satori to the case of the Hibagon, an ape-like cryptid which was reported in Japan in the 1970s. Notably, though, aside from both being ape-like creatures residing in the mountains, the two really have nothing in common at all.